The sun was leaning low when I caught the stillness. Not the gentle hush before nightfall, but a weighted silence that pressed against the air. Out past my split-rail fence, a small figure stood barefoot in the dust, her dress so thin it fluttered against her knees in the evening wind. She didn't move, didn't call out, just wrapped her arms around her belly as if holding herself together. My hand stayed on the hatchet, the day's kindling still at my feet. And I couldn't yet tell if I was looking at trouble or someone who'd run clean out of choices. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to decide in the space of a heartbeat whether to open your door or turn someone away. My name's Elias Cobb. Folks in Red Bluff know me as that soldier fella, though most have long since quit asking what side I fought for. Truth is, I don't much talk about it. The war left me with a stiff shoulder, a taste for quiet, and a habit of fixing what I can with my own two hands. After mustering out, I laid rail for a spell, hauled freight for a while longer. Then bought this narrow strip of stubborn land where the wind never quite rests. Out here you rise before the sun, brew coffee thick enough to hold a spoon, feed the mule and keep the weather from tearing the place apart one board at a time. I was raised in a house where a man's word was worth more than the coins in his pocket. My father taught me to mend a fence before it fell, and to offer a neighbor water before they asked. My mother kept the Sabbath with the windows open, hymns drifting into the yard, and she fed any traveler whose boots found our porch. We weren't rich, never more than a few dollars tucked away, but there was always enough to share when it mattered. That sort of living stays with you, even when the years put distance between the lessons and the life you're leading. Red Bluff's a place caught between two worlds. Half-still dust roads and horse rails, half inching toward the shine of railroad money and land deeds drawn in some office 3 counties away. I've seen ranchers lose good grazing to speculators who never dirtied their boots. And I've watched small shops fold when freight lines shifted. Folks like me keep our heads down, trade in town when we must, and tend our own. My cabin's patched with mismatched planks, my barn leans worse each spring, but it's mine. Or at least it was, until the day I first saw the girl. She stood there at the fence line like a shadow. The wind forgot to carry off eyes fixed on me, silent as stone. There was something in that stillness that made the air feel different, like a door had opened somewhere I couldn't see yet. I didn't know then what path had brought her, or who might be following, but the sun was dropping. And in the space between one breath and the next, I knew my days of living unseen on the edge of Red Bluff were about to change. The girl stayed at the edge of the fence, still as a fence post, eyes locked on mine. I didn't step toward her, just set the hatchet down and walked slow to the porch. Inside, I cut a piece of cornbread, wrapped it in an old cloth, and set it on the railing. Then I sat on the top step with my hands on my knees, watching the dirt instead of her. After a long moment, she came forward, her bare feet dragging her arms still tight around herself. She took the bread with both hands and ate like the food was new to her, each bite small and careful. When she finished, I brought out a blanket. She hesitated, then stepped close enough to take it. I nodded toward the corner of the porch, sheltered from the wind by the rain barrel. She curled up there without a word. By morning, she was gone. The blanket was folded neat on the step, no sign of her in the yard or beyond the fence. I went about the day as usual, but found myself glancing toward the road more than once. 3 days later, near sundown, the mule gave a short snort from the lean-to. I looked up from the chicken coop and saw her again, this time with a woman beside her. The woman's clothes hung loose on her frame, her hair pulled back in a rough tie. She had the same watchful look as the girl, but her eyes held something sharper, a readiness for refusal. "We're not looking for charity," she said. "Just somewhere to stop running." I saw the faint bruises along her collarbone and the way her fingers twitched when the wind shifted. The girls stayed close against her side, as if moving together was the only way they knew how to walk. Without a word, I turned open the cabin door and left it wide. Inside, the fire's heat made the air softer. The woman stepped in and took in the room, a single bed in the corner, a cot near the hearth, the straight-back chair with its sun-faded cushion. The smell of beans hung in the air. She stayed near the door until I set out 3 bowls and gestured toward the table. They ate without comment. Beans, hard bread, coffee, the girl holding her spoon tight. The woman glancing toward the door now and again. When the meal was done, she rose to help with the dishes, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hands were red from the cold water, her movements quiet but sure. I spread a quilt on the floor by the stove. The girl's eyes brightened at the sight, not for softness, but for the promise of warmth. They settled there while I sat in my chair, boots still on, eyes on the fire. After a time, the woman asked, "You got a wife?" I shook my head. "Children, no." She didn't press. She pulled the girl closer, and they sat together without speaking. In the light from the stove, the bruises at her wrists looked older, the kind that fade slow. I didn't ask about them. Later, she said they'd come from Baker's Ridge, looking for a place away from a man who wasn't safe to be near. She didn't offer a name. I didn't need it. Long after they lay under the quilt, I stayed awake listening to the steady sound of their breathing, the wind slipping under the eaves. I hadn't had anyone sleep under my roof in years. The morning came pale and cold. I rose quiet, not wanting to wake them, and stepped out to feed the mule and scatter grain for the hens. The frost clung to the grass, the fog lying low across the field. I thought about the miles between here and Baker's Ridge and the kind of need that would drive a woman and child to walk them. When I came back inside, they were both awake. The woman, May Harper, stood at the basin, rinsing her face in cold water. The girl Lottie sat on the edge of the cot, her feet swinging above the floor. May said she'd been cooking since she was 12, and I let her take the skillet cracking eggs into the pan without spilling a drop. After breakfast, May took a basket to gather kindling. I lent her a hat against the wind. Lottie stayed inside, wandering the room, touching the worn edges of the table, the shelf with its few keepsakes. She found a small tin train, its paint faded. I wound it and set it rattling across the table. She gave a quick laugh, high and short, like she hadn't heard herself make that sound in a while. When May came back with her arms full of dry wood, she mentioned the north roof of the barn was coming loose. Said she could patch it if I had a hammer. I led her to the shed, and we worked side by side until the light began to fade. She didn't ask questions about the cabin or the photo behind the stove of a boy in a blue coat. I didn't ask why she knew her way around tools. That night, we ate stew. Lottie's hair was neatly braided. She held her spoon with more ease now. After supper, I stepped onto the porch, the cold settling into my coat. May joined me, her arms crossed. "We've been running near 2 years," she said. "Every time I think we're safe, something breaks." She didn't ask to stay. She offered to work cook and keep the girl in line. I told her I didn't regret letting them in. She nodded once and went inside. I stayed out longer, listening to the wind in the grass. I didn't know how long they meant to be here, but the choice to send them away didn't sit right. Not that night. When I rose before dawn the next morning, the cold inside was sharp enough to see my breath. From under the quilt, Lottie stirred her hand, resting near her mother's heart. They both looked like they'd slept deeper than they had in months. May was soon up hauling water from the well. Without a word, we worked in quiet, passing buckets, pouring them into the trough. "You plan to stay through winter?" I asked, surprising myself. She said it depended on me. I didn't say more, but the question stayed between us. That afternoon, May found fabric scraps in an old chest and asked to sew curtains for the window above the sink. By evening, they were cut and pinned, ready for stitching. Lottie dozed by the stove while May worked at the table. The cabin had a different sound now, the low hum of a woman sewing, the steady breath of a sleeping child, the slow pop of the fire. As the last of the daylight faded, I stepped out to bring in wood. The cold bit at my ears, but the sight of the lamp burning through the window drew me back in. May looked up from her sewing, and Lottie's head lifted from the quilt. For the first time since they arrived, I realized I'd stopped wondering when they might leave. The days began to fall into a quiet rhythm. Morning started early, with May already at the basin or by the stove, while Lottie rubbed her eyes against the light. I would step outside into the sharp air boots crunching on frost to feed the mule and scatter grain for the hens. By the time I came back in, coffee would be set out, and Lottie would be sipping warm milk still wrapped in a quilt. May kept herself busy. She mended shirts with small, even stitches, scrubbed the floorboards on her hands and knees, and hung quilts over the rail to air in the sun. She spoke little, but the way her hands moved told more than words. Lottie followed me more often now, padding along the fence line or crouching near the coop while I worked. Her questions came without warning, sometimes about the animals, sometimes about the names of tools. She listened hard to the answers, her eyes steady on mine. One afternoon, May asked if she could tend the south fence. A section had sagged where the post had rotted through. We worked together, digging out the base, setting it straight, packing the earth back tight. She carried her share without complaint. Sleeves rolled the wind, tugging at her hair. I noticed she always kept her back to the open field, eyes toward the house or the work at hand. Lottie sat nearby, stacking small rocks in piles, humming under her breath. When the fence was fixed, May wiped her brow with the back of her hand and glanced toward the barn. "That roof still holding?" she asked. I told her the north side had been patched, but the ridge could use another nail line before winter. She nodded as though she'd been expecting the answer. Later that week we were up there together, the sound of the hammer ringing against the quiet fields. Evenings settled slow. Lottie would curl up near the stove with a tattered book, May's voice steady as she read. The lamplight softened the hard edges of the room. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and the sky stretched wide over the ridge. It was the kind of stillness you could feel in your chest. One cold morning, with the fog clinging low, I hitched the mule to the small cart for a trip into Red Bluff. May stood near the barn, her arms folded. She didn't ask to go, just told me they didn't need anything. Lottie waved from the porch, holding a worn doll she'd found in the rafters. I raised a hand before turning down the road. The ride into town was long and near empty, only cattle in the distance, and the rattle of the cart wheels on the hard ground. At the general store, I gathered coffee flour and lamp oil. Vernon Talley, the shopkeeper, eyed the extra supplies. "Expecting company?" he asked. I kept my tone even, saying I was just stocking early. He shrugged and rang up the total. As I stepped outside, I noticed a man leaning against the post, his coat clean but worn, his eyes tracking me without a word. He wasn't a local. I knew the type, the kind that looked for something or someone. I passed without slowing, but his gaze followed me until I turned the corner. By the time I reached home, the sun was low over the ridge. The cabin was quiet firewood stacked neatly by the door. Inside, Lottie was bent over the table drawing with a stub of charcoal. May was at the basin, sleeves wet. I told her about the man, describing his brown vest and black hat. She froze for a moment, then went back to scrubbing. "One of his brothers?" she said. "You think he followed you here?" I asked. "I don't know," she replied, "but if he's around, it won't take long." There was no fear in her voice, only a tired certainty. That night I stood on the porch with my rifle laid across my arm. Inside, May braided Lottie's hair by lamplight, the girl leaning against her shoulder. The sound of their voices carried through the door. I thought about the man in town, about the way May's face had changed when she recognized him. I stayed outside until well after midnight, watching the dark. The days that followed were marked by a different kind of quiet. Curtains stayed drawn. Lamps were dimmed earlier. Lottie played less in the yard, keeping closer to her mother. May moved through her tasks with the same steady hands, but her shoulders stayed tight. I kept the shotgun near the door, checking the rifle each morning, walking the fence line at dusk. On the third morning, May came to the shed where I was mending a hinge. She stood in the doorway, the wind pulling at her dress. "If it comes to it, I can shoot," she said. I looked up. "You ever had to?" She nodded once. "One time. Missed, but it was enough to stop him." I told her there was a 12 gauge under the bed, not much to look at, but it would fire. She didn't thank me, just gave a short nod. Later that day, Lottie trailed me to the barn. She liked to watch without talking, mimicking how I swung the pail or checked the feed. Out of nowhere, she asked if I'd ever had a daughter. I told her no, only a brother once. She tilted her head. "You're nice. You should have had one." I didn't answer, just handed her a handful of grain to toss toward the hens. That night the wind rose again. We ate stew with the fire banked high. May leaned against the table, a mug between her hands. "You think he'll come here?" she asked. "If that was his brother in town, he knows how to find this place," I said. She held my eyes. "He doesn't scare easy." I told her I didn't either. Before bed, I opened the trunk under the cot and brought out the shotgun. May saw it, said nothing, and locked the windows. I sat in the chair by the door with the gun across my lap, boots still on coat over my legs. Sleep came only in short stretches. Sometime in the night, I heard the faint crunch of a boot on frost. I eased the door open an inch. A shadow moved near the fence, slipping between the trees. I raised the rifle sight steady, but didn't fire. The shape paused, then turned back into the dark. I shut the door and locked it. At first light, I followed the tracks to the edge of the property. They weren't from any deer. When I returned, May was at the stove. "You saw something," she said. I nodded. "Wasn't friendly." She set down the ladle. "Then we ought to be ready." The next 2 days carried the weight of waiting. May didn't press for details about the shadow I'd seen near the fence, and I didn't offer them. Still, the change was plain. Curtains stayed shut, lamps turned low before dark, and Lottie's laughter quieted to a hum she kept close to herself. May moved through her work with the same steady hands, but she stayed within a few steps of the stove or the window, her eyes following more than just her needle or the pot on the fire. I kept to the outside, fixing what didn't truly need fixing. I walked the fence line twice each afternoon, checking the slope where the brush grew thick. Any small gap got patched, any leaning post reset. By the end of the second day, the porch was stacked with more firewood than I usually cut in a week. May didn't comment, but she salted down the last of the pork and baked 3 loaves of bread without saying why. That evening, I told Lottie to come with me for a walk to the far edge of the property. Her boots were 2 big mittens slipping on her hands, but she kept up without complaint. We moved along the frozen ground, the sound of our steps mixing with the wind. She didn't speak until we turned back toward the house. "Why'd you help us?" she asked. I told her it hadn't felt right to send them away. She nodded once and said other folks had. By the time we reached the porch, her small hand had found mine, and neither of us mentioned it. The next day, May asked if I'd ever lost someone close. I told her about my brother Daniel, killed in the 2nd year of the war. She spoke of a sister taken by fever when they were both young. We left it at that, sitting in the quiet, the fire throwing light across the floor. After a while, she said she wished the man would come and be done with it. I told her he would, and we'd be ready. That night, I cleaned the shotgun and checked the cartridges. May slipped a small revolver into her coat pocket after looking over the cylinder. Lottie slept deep, her doll clutched tight, while May sat near the stove, her eyes fixed on the flames. When I offered her the cot, she shook her head. "I'm not resting till I know she's safe." I pulled my chair beside hers, and we sat that way, until the first pale light touched the frost on the windows. Just after 5, a board creaked outside, slow and deliberate. I rose without a sound and eased the curtain back. A man stood at the far corner of the barn. Tall coat hat pulled low, a rifle slung across his shoulder. I told May, and she was already on her feet, her hand in her coat pocket. She glanced at Lottie, still asleep, and said she'd keep her down behind the stove. I stepped out into the cold. The man turned when he heard the door walking toward me with steady steps. We met halfway between the porch and the well. "You Elias Cobb?" he asked. I told him I was. He said he was looking for a woman named Melanie and a girl about so high, holding his hand at his hip. I didn't answer. His eyes were cold, his smile thin, the kind you see on a man used to getting his way. "You the one she ran from?" I asked. He smirked and said he just wanted what was his. I told him she wasn't his. That hung in the air between us. His hand moved toward his belt, but I raised the shotgun enough to make the choice clear. "I buried better men than you," I said, "and I won't think twice if you take one more step." For a moment I thought he'd try. But then something in my eyes must have told him it wouldn't go his way. He stepped back, spat into the dirt, and said she'd run again, that women like her always did. I told him if she did, it would be with her head high. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without looking back. I stood there until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the trees. Only when the cold had settled deep into my coat did I lower the gun and head back inside. May was crouched by the stove, one arm around Lottie, who was wide-eyed and holding tight to her mother's dress. "He gone?" she asked. I nodded. She let out a long breath, the kind you don't know you've been holding. Lottie looked at me and said, "You didn't shoot him." I told her I didn't need to. By afternoon, the curtains were open for the first time in weeks. May washed her hair and let it dry in the cold air without hurrying to bring it in. Lottie helped me with the chickens, her humming returning as she scattered feed. That night, we all sat on the porch, listening to the wind in the grass and an owl calling somewhere in the dark. No locks on the door, only the fire inside, and the sound of someone breathing next to someone else, knowing we'd made it through. The cold stayed sharp in the mornings, frost clinging to the grass, until the sun worked its way over the ridge. May was already up, most days, sleeves rolled as she brought in water or stirred the fire back to life. Lottie had taken to shadowing me again, her small boots crunching behind mine on the way to the barn. She didn't ask much, just watched, and every so often, her hand would slip into mine without a word. We kept the porch stacked high with wood and the pantry in order. May still kept a revolver close, though she no longer glanced toward the tree line quite as often. I'd catch her at the table mending one of my shirts, not for holes, but to take in the shoulders or shorten the sleeves. "You're thinning out," she said once. I told her I was just working harder. She shook her head, told me to sit before I worked myself to the ground. By late February, the snow that never came had given way to clear skies and hard ground. One morning, May mentioned taking Lottie into town to see about schooling come spring. "They let girls go?" Lottie asked me. I told her they did one-room schoolhouse run by Miss Clary. Lottie asked if her mother would come with her the first day, and May nodded. When we did ride in, the air was brisk enough to nip at our cheeks. May wore her hair pinned back neat, and Lottie clutched a small satchel we'd made from scrap leather. We stopped at the general store for flour and coffee, then walked over to the schoolhouse. Miss Clary knelt to Lottie's height and asked if she could count to 10. Lottie grinned and counted twice. On the ride back, May sat a little easier in the cart. Lottie chattered about the school and the teacher, and for the first time since that man had shown up at the barn, the road home didn't feel quite so long. That evening, May lit the lamp and stirred a pot on the stove, her humming carrying through the room. Lottie sat at the table with her book, sounding out the first few letters she'd learned from her mother. The days that followed settled into a steadier pace. May scrubbed the floorboards and hung quilts in the sunlight. Lottie helped me with the hens and even named the mule Oscar. I didn't correct her, just nodded when she said it. The air in the cabin felt different now, warmer, though the fire burned no higher than before. One Sunday, I found May out by the clothesline, folding the last of the laundry. She said the curtains could use a wash before spring. I offered to take them down, but she shook her head and told me to finish the fence work on the west side. The boards had been loose for years, and I'd never bothered to fix them proper. That afternoon, she brought me a tin cup of coffee and stood watching while I worked. There was a look in her eyes I couldn't quite place, but it wasn't fear. As March edged closer, the air softened and the fields began to smell of damp earth. One evening, after Lottie had gone to bed, May asked if I ever thought about the way it had turned out. I told her I hadn't expected it. She said she hadn't stayed. She'd just stopped running. We let that sit between us, the fire snapping in the stove. Later that night, I carried Lottie from the porch, where she'd fallen asleep against her mother's side. She stirred eyes half shut and asked if I was going anywhere. I told her I was right there. May stood in the doorway, arms folded, and said her daughter believed in me. She added quiet but steady that she did too. The wind outside had gone still, the kind of stillness that comes before the season turns. But there was something else in it, a sense that whatever road we were on now, we were all walking it together. Spring came slow, the kind where frost still clung to the windows in the morning, and the earth stayed hard until midday. I kept to my routine, though it wasn't just my own anymore. May had the curtains open each morning, letting in the pale light, while Lottie set out the tin mugs for coffee. The cabin no longer felt like a place someone passed through. It had the sound of a place being lived in. One afternoon, I rode into Red Bluff alone for flower nails and kerosene. The air carried the first hint of thaw. But the streets were still quiet, most folks tending to winter repairs before planting season. At the feed store, Vernon Talley asked if I'd seen anyone wandering the ridge roads. Said a man matching the same description I'd seen months back had been inquiring about a woman and a child. I told Vernon I hadn't seen a thing. His eyes lingered on me a moment before he let it drop. I finished my errands without hurry and started the ride home, with the cart rattling behind. A few miles out, I caught the distant dust of a single rider, keeping to the tree line. He never closed the distance, but he never disappeared either. I kept him in the corner of my eye until the road curved enough to hide him. Back at the cabin, May was kneeling by the stove, Lottie beside her with a book in hand. I mentioned the rider, and May's jaw tightened. Could be him, could be someone he sent, she said. I asked if she wanted to leave for a while, but she shook her head. We've been running too long. I'd rather be ready here. That night, I checked the shotgun and set it where it could be reached quick. May laid out the revolver on the table and cleaned it by lamplight, while Lottie dozed in the chair beside her. The fire burned steady, throwing a warm glow against the walls, but the air carried that quiet weight I'd felt before trouble. The next few days, we worked close to the cabin. I mended the hinge on the barn door. May took in more of my shirts, and Lottie helped me patch the chicken coop. Still, every so often, I'd catch May's eyes sliding toward the ridge, or Lottie's gaze fixed a little too long on the bend in the road. On the fourth morning, I found fresh hoof prints just beyond the west fence. They weren't ours. May was at the wash basin when I told her, and she paused only a moment before going back to scrubbing. Then we know he's close, she said. That night, she kept her coat on even after the fire warmed the room. By the end of the week, the signs grew clearer. A broken branch near the back pasture, the faint smell of smoke from somewhere down the slope. Whoever it was, they were testing the edges. I started carrying the rifle, even on short walks to the barn, and I caught May doing the same with a revolver when she went to gather eggs. One evening after supper, we sat on the porch while Lottie played in the yard. The sun was slipping low, painting the ridge in long shadows. May spoke without looking at me. If he comes, I don't want you holding back on my account. I told her we'd do what needed doing. No more, no less. She nodded once, her eyes still fixed on the darkening tree line. The next morning brought a hard wind from the west, bending the dry grass flat. I stepped out to check the fence and saw a scrap of fabric caught on the wire, dark brown, like the coat I'd seen in Red Bluff months ago. I took it to May, and she turned it over in her hands before setting it down. "He's not far now," she said. That night I didn't bother with the chair. I sat on the floor near the door, shotgun across my lap, listening to the wind rattle the eaves. May stayed up at the table sewing by the light of a single lamp. The clock on the shelf ticked steady, marking the long hours until dawn. When morning came, the ground held new hoof tracks leading up from the south trail. They stopped just short of the fence before turning back. I followed them as far as the ridge and saw where the rider had waited, looking down toward the cabin. The ashes of a small fire marked the spot. I rode back slow, scanning the tree line. The cabin came into view with smoke curling from the chimney, and I knew the time for waiting was near its end. As I stepped onto the porch, May met my eyes through the window. No words passed, but we both understood what came next. The wind had settled by the time dusk came, leaving the air still and heavy. I sat at the table cleaning the shotgun, oiling the hinge until it moved smooth and quiet. May was by the stove stirring a pot without looking at it much, her eyes drifting toward the window. Lottie sat cross-legged on the floor with her doll speaking in a low voice, as if the doll could answer back. When the knock came, it was sharp and even. I rose, the shotgun balanced in one hand, and opened the door just enough to see the man from the ridge standing there. His coat was the same dark brown I'd seen caught on the fence hat, low, a pistol resting at his side, but not yet raised. His eyes moved past me toward the room behind. I stepped onto the porch, pulling the door nearly shut behind me. "Evening," I said. He didn't bother with a greeting. "She's here. The woman and the girl. I've come to take them." His voice had that slow drag of a man who thought time was on his side. "You're not taking anyone," I told him. His mouth curved, but it wasn't a smile. "She's mine. She ran, but she knows where she belongs." I kept my voice even. "She doesn't belong to you or to any man." His hand twitched toward his pistol, and I lifted the shotgun just enough to make the message clear. Behind me, the door creaked. May stepped out onto the porch, her revolver in her hand, barrel pointed at the ground, but ready. Lottie was nowhere in sight. She'd have gone to the corner near the stove just as we'd agreed if this moment came. The man's eyes narrowed. "You think she'll be safe here? You think she won't run again?" May's voice cut in, steady and cold. "If I run, it won't be from fear, and it won't be toward you." He looked at her for a long beat, his jaw tight, then shifted his gaze back to me. "I could put you in the dirt right now," he said. "And I could put you there quicker," I answered. We stood like that, the distance between us holding more than just space. His eyes measured mine, maybe weighing pride against the sense that he'd already lost this ground. Finally, he stepped back slow and deliberate, then turned toward the horse tied at the road. "She'll regret it," he said without looking back. "Not as much as you will if you return," I told him. He mounted up and rode into the dark, the sound of hoofbeats fading until the night took them. I stayed on the porch until the last echo was gone. May hadn't lowered her revolver until I nodded. When we stepped back inside, Lottie was curled on the quilt by the stove, clutching the doll to her chest. "He gone?" she asked. May crouched beside her, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "He's gone." The rest of the evening passed in a quieter way. May left the curtains open while she washed up, letting the lantern light spill out into the yard. Lottie sat at the table drawing with a stub of pencil, her lines looping into shapes she didn't name. Later, we stepped outside, the three of us sitting on the porch, while the wind moved gently through the grass. An owl called from somewhere in the dark. No one spoke. There didn't seem a need. The danger had passed for now, and the air felt easier to breathe. When we went in for the night, I set the shotgun back in its place but left the door unlatched. May glanced at it, then at me, and gave the faintest nod. We slept without the heaviness of waiting, the kind that had sat in the room for weeks. Morning light crept in slow, touching the floorboards with a pale gold. The air smelled of coffee and the faint tang of gun oil from the night before. May was already up, hair pulled back, setting a cup in front of me. Lottie's bare feet padded softly across the room as she climbed onto the bench, her doll tucked under her arm. We didn't speak much while we ate. There was no need. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, just the kind that comes when people have seen trouble through and know it's behind them. Outside, the frost was lifting off the grass, leaving the yard damp and shining. By midday, Sheriff Barnes rode up. His face was set in that look lawmen wear when they bring news that could go either way. He stepped down, hat in hand. "He won't be back," he said. "Caught him near the state line. Judge'll see to it from here." May's shoulders eased, the first real breath she'd taken in days. Lottie leaned into her side, not quite knowing why, but feeling the change in the air. The sheriff stayed long enough for coffee, then tipped his hat and left. We watched him ride out until the dust settled. The yard seemed wider somehow, the sky a shade brighter. May turned to me, her voice low. "I can start again now, somewhere that's mine." We spent the afternoon mending fence along the south line. Lottie handed us nails, her small hands quick to help. By the time the sun dipped low, the boards were straight, and the place looked whole again. That night, lantern light spilled across the table while May stitched a new hem in Lottie's dress. I sat by the fire, boots off, listening to the quiet hum of needle through cloth. The wind outside was soft, carrying the smell of pine. I've learned the frontier will test a person, but it will also show you who'll stand beside you when the dust rises. Bloodkin doesn't always make a family. Sometimes it's the ones who find you when you've got nothing left. When I think back on it, I reckon the land gives as much as it takes if you meet it with steady hands and an open heart. That's how we keep going out here. If you've walked through your own kind of storm, maybe you know what I mean. And if this story stayed with you, I'd be glad for you to share it so it might reach someone who needs to hear it too.